This is the Dr. A Show with your host, Dr. Will Aguila.
Hello and welcome to the show. I've been hosting this show for almost 2 years now with a variety of excellent guests and celebrities that have a positive message to share with you. I am delighted to welcome our newest stations in the Tampa Bay area. The Dr. A Show will now air every week on WTIN AM 1340 and WDCF AM 1350 as well as WCHR AM 1400. A shout out to our newest fans and thank you for listening. Today we have for you a touching story about a man whose life changed in an instant when he kissed his wife and child goodbye and boarded a train headed for work. Little did he know that a few hours later, his wife would be dead and his child critically injured by a truck driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel. We will show you how he turned this tragedy into a loving story of hope. In our second segment, we will have the lovely Miss Lisa Gibbons, who will tell us and give us a guide to creating happy endings and new beginnings with her new book, Take Two. But first, your life can change in a second when a distracted or drunk driver loses control of the vehicle and plummets into yours. Such is the story of Martin Spinelli. On a beautiful September morning, Sasha Roberts drops her husband off at a train station and heads off to take her young son to preschool. It is a journey she and 4-year-old Leo had made many times before. But this morning would turn out to be very different. A truck driver who had been driving for 3 days without his legally required brakes fell asleep at the wheel and plowed into their Nissan. Their car was thrown spinning into the air, windows smashing on impact. Sasha was killed instantly, and Leo suffered multiple skull fractures and a shattered leg. Leo lay in a coma and was not expected to survive, but with his father's love and strong faith, Leo recovered. Martin Spinelli is here with us today to tell us this touching story. Martin has produced award-winning new features for NPR as well as the BBC. He has also produced the acclaimed literary series Line Break and Radio. His book is called After the Crash. Hi, Martin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dr. A.
Martin, about how many people you think die or are injured every year by distracted or impaired drivers?
There are thousands of people who are killed every year in industrialized countries as a result of distracted driving or people who are dozing off at the wheel because they're tired. The figures in Europe are 3 out of every 1,000 adult deaths are attributable to distracted driving, which is pretty staggering.
That is a large number. But a lot of us don't even realize that there are that many people who have suffered from driver fatigue and actually fall asleep. I mean, you know that people can be under the influence or can be distracted with cell phones or texting, but falling asleep, that's fairly common then.
Yeah, it is extremely common. And recent studies, both in the States and in the UK, show that something like in between 40 and 50% of 30-year-old drivers admit to driving while drowsy, which is a much higher number than admit to driving while drunk. It's a real epidemic that people need to be made aware of because it does pose such a great risk to people, to young families on the road like mine. And it's something that needs to be confronted and dealt with both in a legislative way, but also just in terms of a kind of spreading the word awareness way.
But a lot of people may think that, well, that's not their fault, right? You fall asleep while driving. You can't help it. It's just it's accidental.
Absolutely. But the guilt that you will carry around with you for the rest of your life if your accident caused somebody to become seriously injured or even kill someone, that is something that, you know, whether you meant to do it or not, it still happened. It's still the result of your negligence, still the result of you not doing what you should, and it's a terrible thing to have to deal with. I know from my own experience trying to reach out to the truck driver that killed my wife and almost killed my son, that his pain and his grief are incredible. incredibly deep and something that he will never shake.
You're presuming that these people who have driver fatigue are not on any medications or drugs or anything like that, right? This is just purely tired.
This is just from people driving more than they should. The truck driver that caused our crash was driving for 3 consecutive days without taking his legally required breaks. So when the police looked at his driving records, they saw that he hadn't been taking the rests that he was required to take, and they presumed that he just fell asleep at the wheel. He just dozed off the wheel and ran into the back of my wife's Nissan and sent my son flying from the car, caused him severe brain damage and a terribly shattered and mutilated left leg, and killed my wife instantly.
Let's talk a little bit about your wife. Her name was Sasha, correct?
Yes, yeah. Sasha was a fantastic woman. She was so clever. She was so gifted. She was so talented in so many ways. She, like me, was an academic. We were both very, very into our careers, publishing and broadcasting and having work displayed in galleries and museums, and we were really proud of our accomplishments. But she was also a fantastic mother, really, really brilliant and dedicated to raising a really fantastic little boy, and we miss her every day.
So you had a little boy, and he was 4 years old. And what happened on the morning of September of 2006 that changed your life?
On that morning, I was scheduled to give a keynote lecture at a huge international media conference. It was going to be one of the high watermarks of my career. And I was up in the north of England getting ready to give that big talk when 2 police officers tracked me down in the lobby of the hotel I was staying at. And I knew something was wrong immediately because they couldn't look me in the eye, and they lacked that kind of slightly confident swagger that police officers have. And they told me that my wife had been killed and that my son, Leo, was very near to death in a hospital down in London.
But you had a premonition that morning, correct? That something just wasn't right.
I did. We had a very, very unusual parting at the train station. She dropped me off at the train station in the town where we live. You know, she dropped me off at that train station dozens and dozens and dozens of times before, and there was just something a little bit uncanny about it. And I did things and said things that I would have never done before, and she did the same. And you know, one of the things that I did was after I said goodbye to Leo and Sasha in the car, I got back in the car, and I went into the back seat, and I put my hand on my son's cheek, and I said, "Remember, Leo, I'll always be with you." And you know, that seems kind of exaggerated now that I tell it to you, and it felt exaggerated when I was writing it in the book, but is exactly what I did and what I said. And then she came around and also said something that was a bit weird. She said, "Don't let these cynical Brits get you down," and which was unusual because I thought of ourselves as very kind of critical, judgmental, savvy people, you know, if not cynical. There was just something odd about that parting. And I remember it to this day very, very vividly, down to the smell of her hair and the shirt she was wearing. And I remember watching them drive off up the street while I headed down into the station to catch that train up north. And I can't explain it, but in retrospect, you know, I clearly had a premonition. Something clearly was going on inside me that was kind of preparing me for this monumental event that was going to happen a few hours later.
And then you found out that your son was actually survived but was in a coma.
Yeah.
And their doctors had not given him a very good chance.
Yeah,
so they were not a good prognosis.
It was not. I mean, I made my way as fast as I could to the hospital where he was in, and I found him in pediatric intensive care, surrounded by a rainbow of computer screens, operating his life support machines. He had a ventilator. He had a shaven head, big gash on the top of his head and on his forehead, terribly mutilated and shattered left leg, foam blocks around his head and neck, keeping him still, an air blanket on him, regulating his body temperature because the part of his brain that regulates body temperature had been damaged.
Our guest is Martin Spinelli, award-winning writer and producer, as well as author of After the Crash. His story of loss, faith, and courage is an inspiration to anyone who's been faced with a crisis. Martin's life changed one September morning in southern England in 2006 when the car carrying his wife and then 4-year-old child was hit by a truck driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel. How do you tell your son that his mother was killed in the same accident that injured him? We will ask our guest, Martin Spinelli, author of After the Crash, when we return to the Dr. A Show. Stay with us.
And now, back to the Dr. A Show with your host, Dr. Will Aguila.
Welcome back to the Dr. A Show. Our guest is Martin Spinelli, award-winning writer and producer, as well as author of After the Crash. His story of loss, faith, and courage is an inspiration to anyone who's been faced with a crisis. Martin's life changed one September morning in southern England in 2006 when the car carrying his wife and then 4-year-old child was hit by a truck driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel. Sasha, his wife, died at the scene, but his son survived but was in a coma and was critically injured. Martin, for the break, we were talking about how the doctors gave him a very slim chance and said that even if he did survive, you would have to face severe brain injury and difficulties in cognition. But you kept fighting. I mean, how did you know to do that?
I don't really know where it came from, but I just had this sense that what I was hearing wasn't necessarily the way things had to be. And I remember the last words my wife said to me, and I tried to cultivate a positive mindset, and I thought hard, and I visualized all the time about just the simple little things that Leo would do in his childhood when he got out of the hospital. The going on camping trips, the hiking in the mountains, the building Pinewood Derby cars, the sledding with his friends. I just kept in my mind all of those things that I felt sure had yet to be part of his childhood that he was going to do. And a lot of the credit has to rest with Leo himself. You know, he was an incredibly tenacious little boy, 4-year-old boy, when faced with such brutal injuries and when faced with the loss of his mother. He just simply refused to accept the prognoses that were laid at his feet every day. Every time somebody put a limit in front of him, he just ignored it. You know, the doctor said that he would die that first night and that I should consider donating his organs, and he didn't die. And I took that simple fact that he was still alive, that he was still with us in the morning, as a grain of hope that I could cling to and live with and remind me that things are possible beyond what critical doctors might say. And almost every day, they would revise up his best case scenario. They said, well, it's great that he survived, but prepare yourself for the fact that he might be in a coma for the rest of his life. Well, within 2 weeks, his eyes opened.
So you kept a diary, too, right? You kept a diary along with the neurosurgeon that asked you to do that? And you compared what was happening every day? Yeah, it's called a storm diary, and it's a pretty common thing people do when one of their family members goes into a traumatic coma, and you note all the little tiny movements or the way he's breathing in a little diary, and you hope to connect these movements and these changes in breathing with things that are happening in the outside world, with massages that he's getting or therapies that he's getting or times of day or times medication is going down his IV line. And you use that as clues to kind of help push you out of the coma, to figure out what is the best way to get this particular patient out of a coma. And that storm diary, is something that I still have and still look back on whenever I need to be reminded about how far we've come and what an astounding and miraculous recovery my young son made. And it's a good, scary thing to have, but it provides me a bit of support every now and again. How did it feel when he opened his eyes?
It was unbelievable. Time just stood still. I remember that moment when I was actually holding him in my arms for the first time since the crash, and his bed was being changed, and his eyes did open a tiny, tiny little sliver. I remember looking into the blueness of his eyes and just sending up hosannas of joy for the fact that his eyes were opening, and when I was told that moment might never come to pass, it's a moment that I will cherish forever.
How difficult was the recovery after that?
Well, we're 6 years on now from the crash, and there's still bits of recovery that we're going through. He still has speech and language therapy, and his left thigh isn't growing anymore, so he has to have it lengthened periodically with a external frame, which he has to wear for 5 or 6 months, which is quite cumbersome. But the actual recovery in the hospital, we were out of the hospital within 3 months, and we did lots and lots of therapy for the next 2 years. But to look at him now, you would not know anything ever happened to him. To watch him on the playground after school with his friends, kicking a ball around or playing tag, you would not know what he's been through, and that's is a remarkable thing, and I'm so grateful for that every single day.
After he recovered enough, you were faced with the challenge of telling him the truth about his mother. How do you tell a 4-year-old boy that his mother died in the accident?
That was the hardest moment, the darkest chapter in this whole story was the moment when I had to tell Leo that his mother had died. I'd started off when he was regaining consciousness and regaining his ability to communicate. I'd started off by lying to him, by telling him that his mother was in another hospital and that she was badly hurt in the accident and maybe wasn't doing as well as he was. But it got harder and harder for the hospital staff to keep their story straight. They were really great about it, and they tried really hard. But Leo, as he was becoming more aware, just started asking more and more questions about her. And I just had to tell him in the end. So I booked a little room in the psychiatric ward, the child psychiatry ward in the hospital in London. And I just sat him down. I didn't think he was ready. I didn't want to deliver him an emotional blow like the physical blow that he'd suffered in the crash, but I just felt I couldn't wait anymore. So I told him, and he couldn't take it in. I mean, he didn't really understand it at first, and it took 3 or 4 tries before the news finally broke through to him, and then he just cried and cried and cried. Because he was also recovering from severe brain injuries, he drifted into this slightly manic, slightly hysterical moment after I told him, and I was really, really worried that I'd really caused some damage. But fortunately, things settled, and he absorbed it in the end, and we went back and opened a new chapter in our lives and tried to go forward without too much looking back.
Martin, are you angry at the driver that caused the accident?
I have every right to be angry, and a lot of people have invited me to be angry, and I think kind of early on initially, certainly in the moments after I heard the news, I was angry. But when I was in the hospital, focused on my son's recovery, when I was in the hospital, just trying to collect every positive feeling that I could and direct it at my son, I just didn't have it in me to be angry with the driver. And I remember one of the first things I told the police that I really wanted to communicate to the driver was the fact that I forgave him. And the police was a bit shocked by this, but I insisted. I don't know whether he ever communicated that. I know that at his sentencing hearing, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for causing death by dangerous driving. The newspapers reported that he did break down in tears. I tried, after a few months had passed, and I started to think about him more and more. I wrote a letter because it was important for me to communicate to him how I was feeling, to communicate to him that I didn't bear him any ill will and that I wanted to close this chapter in both of our lives. And unfortunately, by the time that I had written this letter, which was just over a year after the crash, I called up our police liaison, and I found out that he had already been released from prison and repatriated back to Belgium. He was Belgian. So I had no way of getting this letter to him, so I did the next best thing. I put it in the book after the crash, and I thought, well, maybe one day it'll come across his path, and maybe one day he'll read it. And I hope he does, because I do want him to be able to put this behind him, just like I'm trying to put it behind me.
Martin, well, you are a very courageous man, and your son as well. God bless you both. And I think that you will inspire and help a lot of people who are going through any tragedies, even similar to yours. I thank you very much for being on the show. Once again, the book is called After the Crash, and it's Martin Spinelli, Spinelli. You can follow him on martinspinelli.com. Thanks again, Martin.
Thanks, Dr. A.
Next up, we will have the lovely Miss Lisa Gibbons, who will tell us and give us a guide to creating happy endings and new beginnings with her new book, Take Two, when the Dr. A Show continues.